Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Nun Hey. We're going to go back to this opinion of Rabbah. Rabbah had said, if you remember, that everyone agrees that if it's shrunk, right, if it's now smaller, we go by what it is now. Okay? And then we brought this difficulty from a Braita, but resolved it. Okay? Now we're going to say, Umina. Now from that Braita that we quoted, right, remember we resolved it by saying it was Trumat Maaser. Okay, and then I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but in the end we agreed that this is talking about Trumat Maaser. So now they say Umina, but then from there we can still have a difficulty. Because Amar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi, Abba Hayan Otel Eser Golgarot Shebiktsua Al Tish'im Shebekalkala. My father would take 10 dried figs on 90 fresh figs that were in the basket. Now, Iyamar Bishlam Ad Kemoche and Amrina. If we say we measure it based on, right, we're looking for Trumat Maaser here, which needs to be 1/10. If we go by what they were originally, and not by what they are now, which is what Rabbah said, if they shrink, right, we go by what they are now. Well, if we go by what they originally were, Shapir, this makes perfect sense, because we view them as if they were dates originally, fresh figs, with the proper size. But but if we go by now, bitzarlehu, this is too small a shiur for a maaser. You don't have a 10th. You have less than a 10th because now they shrunk. So if we go by now, we're not going to have enough for the maaser. Rav Dimi, when he came from Israel, he brought the Torah of Rabbi Elazar, and he said that Rabbi Elazar explained to you, this is a unique exception to the rule. Normally, if they shrink, we go by the size they are now. But these can be immediately cooked up and plumped up. They'll be right back to their original size. So they're not really viewed as shrunken because they could go back to their original size. And therefore, 10 dried, smushed up figs are actually equal to 10 fresh figs because they could be reverted back to fresh figs. Okay. Now we're going to bring a Braita on this topic of the figs and the dried and the fresh. Tanu Rabbanan, Tormim te'enim ala golgarot, bimkom sheregilim la'asot te'enim golgarot. Okay, let's try to understand this. We're not going to really understand at this stage. We're going to have to wait for the Gemara's explanation, but let's get the words clear. You can take truma from fresh figs on dried ones. If it's a place where normally they turn fresh figs into dried figs, meaning it's very easy to dry them because everybody does it. But not lo golgarot al te'enim, but you can't take dried figs for fresh figs, meaning, right, you have 10 dried figs on 90 fresh figs. Even if it's a place where normally they dry figs into golgarot. Now, why would you say even in a place like that? Because you would think that if you can easily turn, right, it's very easy, everyone does it, the fresh ones into dry ones, then dry ones could be taken for fresh ones because the fresh ones you can view as if they're dried since they could be dried at any point, and therefore maybe you can take the dried ones, but comes the Braita to say you can't, and we don't really understand why any of this is true. So we're going to have to wait for the Gemara's explanation. So Amar Tormim te'enim ala golgarot. If you didn't understand, don't worry. We really didn't mean to understand anything yet, except for what exactly the case is. Okay, that again, you could do figs, fresh ones on dried ones, if it's a place where people often dry their stuff. But you can't take dried ones on fresh ones, even if it's a place where they normally dry. So again, it didn't make a lot of sense yet. Amar Tormim te'enim ala golgarot, bimkom sheregilim la'asot te'enim golgarot. So what do they first infer here? Obviously, this means bimkom sheregilim in, only if they normally dry them, then you can take the fresh ones and give them for the dry ones. Meaning give the Kohen 10 fresh ones, and that resolves the problem of all your dry ones. Right? It meisers them. But it ties, right? It counts as the truma for them. But bimkom she'en regilim lo. But if you don't normally dry figs, if this isn't a place where people dry the figs very easily, then you cannot. Well, hechidami, what's the case? Okay, we still don't understand this. Ika kohen, if it's a place where there's a lot of kohanim, you can easily give those figs to the kohen. Minkom she'eno ragil amai lo. Why can't, if let's say they don't normally dry, why can't I take these 10 beautiful fresh figs and give them to the Kohen in place of 90 dry, right, to exempt my 90 dry ones. V'hatnan, it says in the Mishnah in Trumot, makom sheyesh kohen torei min hayafa. If there's a Kohen in town, you always want to take the best. What's the best? The best is the fresh. Okay, we'll talk about the problem with the fresh is they don't last long. But if you're giving them to a Kohen right now, so they're the best fresh. Okay, so it shouldn't matter whether people dry them, don't dry them. You're giving them the best produce, which is the fresh. Right? Wouldn't you rather fresh figs for dried ones? So, elapshita, it must be talking about a case, deleka kohen. Now we're going to understand the case. If there's no Kohen around, you can't take fresh, and, okay, there have to be two things. No Kohen around, and it's not a place where it's easy to dry figs. Most people don't. So now you're going to take your fresh figs to basically take as the maaser, to give to the Trumat maaser, to give to the Kohen for all your dried figs. But in the end, those fresh figs, you're going to put them aside and they're going to rot by the time you find a Kohen. And it's not a place where they commonly dry them, so it's not going to be so easy for you to dry them or other people to dry them, right? Maybe it's a cold climate and they won't really dry on your roof. Maybe it rains a lot. It has to be a place where it's very easy to dry them. Either you can hire someone to do it very easily or you can do it yourself. But if it's a place where that's not very commonly done, then taking fresh ones is useless because there's no Kohen. By the time you find a Kohen, they'll be rotten. That's the issue. So we've explained the Reisha, the first case in this Braita, very easily now. We understand it. It's a place where there's no Kohen and they're not used to doing them. In that case, you can't do it. But if there is a Kohen, or there's no Kohen, but they all dry their stuff all the time, then the fresh ones are fine because you just dry them and they'll be fine. Or if there's a Kohen, then you'll just give it to the Kohen directly, whether there is or isn't a drying facility. Okay. But this is a problem, because if we say that the case is talking about, again, we would have to say it's a case where there is no Kohen. Now, let's try that in the second part of the Braita. Ema Seifa, v'lo grogarot al te'inim. You can't take grogarot for te'inim. You can't take the dry ones for the fresh ones. Va'afilu b'makom sheragil la'asot te'inim grogarot. Even if it's very common to do that. Now, ida leka kohen, if there's no Kohen, amai lo. Why can't you take the dry on the fresh? It's better. If there's no Kohen, we want the dry ones. V'hatznan, doesn't it say in the Mishnah, makom she'en kohen, torei min hamitkayem. When there's no Kohen, okay, we'll see there's a machloket here, but Tanakama there says, give from what's going to last. So it's better to give grogarot. So why does the Braita say you can't give the dried ones? Elapshita di'ika kohen. They say the second part of the Braita must be talking about a case where there is no Kohen. And that's why, there is a Kohen. If there is a Kohen, well, then you have to give them the nicer ones. You can't give them the dried ones because you have to give them the nicer ones. Okay? So now, I say, if that's the case, Reisha deleka Kohen, Sefer deika Kohen. That makes no sense to say the first case is talking about a case where there's no Kohen around. The second is talking about a case where there is a Kohen. And that's why you can't give the dry, right? And you can give the fresh in the Reisha because there is a Kohen around. Sorry, I just said it wrong. You can give the fresh in the first one because it's a place where they dry. But if it's not a place where they dry, you can't because there's no Kohen around. The second case, you can't give the dry ones because there is a Kohen, and you have to give the Kohen the better, the fresh stuff. So again, the Reisha is going to be no Kohen, and the Seifa is going to be there is a Kohen. Okay, so now comes, and that seems weird to say that, to which the Gemara says, it's not so crazy. We're stuck, we have no choice. That's what we say in, Reisha deleka Kohen, the Reisha there is no Kohen, Seifa deika Kohen, the Seifa there is a Kohen. Rav Papa now is going to come up with a methodological point that you can come out of this sugya with, which is, Shema Mina, let's infer from here the fact that we explained the Reisha in a case where there's no Kohen, and the Seifa in a case where there is a Kohen. We'd rather take a Braita and explain it, a difficult Braita, and explain it in two different scenarios. One where there is a Kohen, one where there isn't a Kohen. Better than v'lo mukminan b'trei tanai. Better than to establish it according to two Tanaitic opinions. Now, I dropped this idea before, but didn't really say much about it, which is that this opinion that we saw before, where it said, makom she'en kohen torei min hamitkayem. There's no Kohen, you're always better off giving something that's going to last longer. That is a machloket Tani. Rabbi Yehuda says, if there's no Kohen, you still have to bring Minayafa, the better one, the fresh one. So now we're going to say the following. We could have explained the Braita according to two different Tanaitic opinions. How would that work? We'd say that the Reisha, where it said, you can do Te'inim on Grogarot, but only if it's a place where they normally dry, meaning if they don't dry, you can't. Why is that? You can't take fresh ones. Why is that? Because if there's no Kohen, you'd always want it to last longer. That's the Mitkayim. The Seifa, where it says, Grogrot on Te'inim, you can't take Te'inim on Grogarot, right? I'm sorry, I just said it wrong. You can't take Grogarot for Te'inim. Why can't you take Grogarot? Because when there's no Kohen, we don't care that there's no Kohen. Don't give dried ones because you always have to do the nicer ones. And that's the way to explain the second part of the Braita. And that would have been a good explanation. But what do we see here? They chose instead to say, yes, Kohen, no Kohen, or no Kohen, yes, Kohen. Okay, the beginning was no Kohen, the Seifa was yes, Kohen, rather than say the beginning was Tanakam and the Seifa was Rabbi Yehuda. Because they'd rather do it, if you have a choice, better to do it in two different scenarios rather than to say the Braita is talking about two different Tanaitic opinions, even though we've done it sometimes, but that's because we have no choice. But if you have a choice, you should go in that direction. Now we get to the next Mishnah. Kol menachot niloshot beposhrin. All menachot, when you need them with water, you have to use tepid water. Not too hot, not too cold. What's the reason? U'mishalmam shelo yachmitzu. In other words, we have to, number one, use tepid water because otherwise it makes the dough leaven. And also we have to watch it so that it doesn't leaven. It's like making matzah. Now, before we even get into this, there's a whole question. Who said you have to put water in? We never saw that in the Pasuk. We've seen a lot of Pasukim. We talked about the oil. We talked about you bring it with frankincense, but no one ever said anything about water. Where does this water come from? So Rashi and Daf Ayin Daled in the Tavia of Rashi and others, and we're going to see it in Tosfot right now. It's really, I'll tell you what Rashi, in the Tavia of Rashi, we'll talk about what that is when we get to the later Dapim. But in Tosfot, basically, on Daf Nun Zayin, we're going to start there. In the very last Tosfot on the Daf, Minchat Nesachim Mei Peroten, says, Ushar Menachot Yadua de Megablan B'mayim. It says, other Menachot, it's clear that you need them with water. Because they don't have a lot of oil. And you can't possibly mix it with the amount of oil it has. And if you remember, it has to be balul b'shemen, mixed with oil. It has to be a dough. It's not going to be a dough if you don't have enough water in it with just that amount of oil. So because of that, you're going to have to use water. And therefore, according to Tosfot, and Rashi points this out, the Tavia of Rashi on Daf Ayin Daled points out basically that therefore the order is first put the water in, then, after you have the water and the flour mixed together, then you add the oil, because then you can really mix the oil in properly. The Rambam has a different approach. The Rambam says it's not for that reason. You can mix in the oil, he thinks, even without that. He says it's to prepare it for baking. It needs water to bake properly. Because think about it, if it's crumbly, it's not going to bake properly. So you need water in order to have it bake properly. According to him, you put in the water at a later stage. After you've already added the oil, the water comes in at the end. Okay, the later stage before baking. And by the way, if you don't bake it, then you might not even need the oil, according to him. So that's also another nafkamina of the different opinions here. Okay, but now we're going to go back to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says you have to make sure they don't become chametz. And if they do, imichmitzu shiareha over below tase. So there's actually two halachot going on here. One is you can't, when you're kneading, you can't let it leaven. That's before you do the kmitza. Right? Remember, take the kometz and burn it. Then you're left with the remainder. Now, if you let the remainder leaven, you also have a problem. You have to make sure that nothing leavens. Okay? Separate lo taseh for each. Shenema. Now, here's the pasuk proving number one. Okay? How do we know? That before the kmitza. Shenema. Kol mechasher takrivu laHashem. Now, the key word being here, that you will sacrifice to God, meaning before you've sacrificed it. Lo te'aseh chametz. It cannot be done as chametz. This is the pasuk that says kol se'or kol dvash, right? You can't have honey or leaven. Those are not good. Okay? Again, if you haven't had a chance yet to listen to Alana Steinhen Shir on chametz, now is a good time. V'chayav alishata v'alarichata v'alafiyata. And in addition, you're chayav both on kneading, also on setting up the breads, and also on baking them. In other words, shaping the breads. What he's saying here is, you're liable a separate set of lashes on any action you do with the bread with the dough leavening. If the dough leavens while you're kneading, if it's also leavening while you're setting up the dough and while you're baking it, at all those stages you get a separate set of lashes for it. We're going to get into the Gemara to where we see this. So first the Gemara says, where's the source for the shirayim? Because the Gemara brought a source for before you take the komets, but the shirayim is after you take the komets. Obviously, they're only called a remainder after the komets is taken. So, where do we get this from? I'm going to reach Lakish about the shirayim. Okay, we quoted one pasuk before about lo te'aseh chametz. Don't make it chametz. Okay, it can't be done. Done is usually any action relating to the process of making it. That's in Vayikra chapter 2, verse 11. Now we're going to go to Vayikra chapter 6, verse 10. Lo te'afeh chametz chalkam. Okay, don't bake it chametz, the portion. Okay, their portion. So now they say, afilu, what's Rish Lakish's drasha? Afilu chalkam, even part of it, lo te'afeh chametz. What's part of it? The remainder. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. You want to say that lo te'afeh chametz chalkam is coming to talk about the remainder? There's a negative prohibition against having the remainder become chametz? Hi lahachi uda'ata? Is that really coming for this? Hi mebayle lechiditani. That pasuk is needed for a completely different drasha. Turning now to Amabed. Lo te'afeh chametz. Matzamud lamar. So the Brayta starts off quoting the pasuk that we just darshan something else from. Well, what is that saying? Halok far ne'amar lo te'aseh chametz. It already says don't make it chametz. Why do we need also don't bake it chametz? Isn't baking included in the asiyah, the making of the bread? So because it says don't have it be made chametz, you might have thought there's only one. Now here we're going to get to the other issue of the Mishnah. There's only one prohibition, right? You do baking, kneading, all that while it's leavening. It's one prohibition. You get one set of lashes. Talmud lomar, if you just had lo te'aseh, that's one lo te'aseh. Talmud lomar lo te'afeh. So they say therefore, it adds the word don't have it baked. Afiyah bichlal hayta. So now we're going to use one of the principles by which we darshan the Torah. Afiyah bichlal hayta. Afiyah was part of the general rule. Afiyah is part of asiyah. Okay, asiyah means to make the bread. Making the bread includes baking. Lama yatzat. So why was it specified, singled out? Lahakeshela, to make a hekesh, a juxtaposition, to say, to comparison. Ma afiyah miyuchedet, shi maaseh yichidi. What makes afiyah unique? That it's a maaseh yichidi. It's its own unique action. V'chayavin aleh b'fnei atzma. And you're liable lashes because it says, do not have it baked. Right? You're going to get lashes for that. Afani avi lishata v'arichata v'chom maaseh yichidi shaba. So I'm going to bring kneading, setting up the loaf, and any other. Okay, in a second we're going to have a break and say what is any other coming to include that we didn't already include. That for all those things, all those actions, you're going to get your own separate set of lashes. So what's kol maaseh yichidi Shabbat? So the Gemara stops the Brayta for a minute and says this must be coming la tuye kituf. This is adding kituf, which there's a debate about what it is. So we'll go with the explanation that it's putting water on top, like basting it with a little bit of water before, I don't know, basting, but pouring like brushing, like a layer of water on it before it goes to the oven. Okay, which makes it better, look better maybe. Shu maaseh yichidi, so it's not exactly an essential part of the process, but it is a unique action. V'chayavin alav b'fnei atzmo. And if you do that while it's leavening, you're going to get lashes, a whole separate set. Anyway, what was the point of bringing this? So first of all, we did see the source for the last halacha in the Mishnah, that for each one of those actions, you're going to get a separate set of lashes. But the point is, lo te'afeh chametz chalkam, we need specifically for this drasha, not for the shirayim. To which they answer, mechalkam kamrina, no. The drasha about the shirayim was from the words chalkam. This is from the words lo te'afeh chametz. Now it's true, it's all one phrase, lo te'afeh chametz chalkam, but one is darshing lo te'afeh chametz, and the other is chalkam. Okay, so we can do that. So now they say, wait a minute. If you're learning it from lo te'afeh chametz chalkam, you're saying there's a negative prohibition for the shirayim. Why don't we just say, emakule lahachi udata? Maybe the whole pasuk is coming for specifically the halacha we said about the remainder. And maybe it's not coming for the drasha we just saw in the Brayta. So they say no, because im ken lichtov chalkam lo te'afeh chametz. If the main subject of that sentence was the shirayim, it should have started with that. Chalkam, part of them you shouldn't bake chametz. My lo te'afeh chametz chalkam. Why does it start with don't have them baked. Shma mina tarte. Then you can learn both. Okay, because of the order, we get two things from it. Number one, lo te'afeh. You're going to get a lo te'aseh for every single action you do that's like baking. Number two, chalkam. Even when it's the shirayim and not the earlier stage before you do the komet, even the shirayim, you're going to get lashes for it. Now, we're going to question this. Why don't we look at this lo te'aseh and lo te'afeh as a klal uprat? We have lo te'aseh is a general, lo te'afeh is a prat. And what are the rules for klal uprat? Let's see. Ve'ema afiyah de prat barachmana lichayev chada. Inach lichayev chada akulu. So now, before we get to the klal uprat, sorry, I jumped the gun a little. If you say afiyah is specified, so maybe you would say like this. When it comes to lo te'aseh, that's a general rule for all actions. All the actions you do, you're going to get lashes, but one set for all the actions. Only afiyah stands alone. Baking has its own pasuk. That pasuk is to teach you just by baking, you're going to get a separate set of lashes. So if you bake and you knead and you set up the loaf, or let's say knead, set up the loaf and bake while it's chametz, you're going to get one set of lashes for the baking and one set of lashes for all the other actions you did. Why don't we say that? To which they answer, Mishum dehave davar shaya bichlal v'yatza min hachlal lelamed. So this is, right, this is what we said kind of before. It was part of a general rule, and it left the rule, meaning there was lo te'aseh, which was general. Then there was a specific of don't bake. Lo lelamed al atzmo yatza el lelamed al kol kulo yatza. When we have something that was a general phrase, and then we have a specific phrase, the rule is, okay, in other words, we have something, I say it better. We had a general principle that included everything. And then we specifically gave one example within that group of items. It's not yet a klal uprat, it's davar shaya bichlal. It was already included in that general. And then there was this one unique pasuk that came and stood this one out on its own. Well, it doesn't actually come to teach just about itself. It comes to teach about all the other things. So that's how we know that all the other things are included as well, that you're going to get a separate set of lashes. But now they say, what I by accident said earlier, which is, why don't we say it's a klal uprat? Ema lo te'aseh klal, lo te'afeh prat. Now, what do you have when you have a klal and prat? Klal uprat, ein beklal elamasha beprat. When you have a general phrase and then a specific one, the rules are only things that are like the specific one, which means afiyah in midachrini lo. It means you would get lashes specifically for baking. You won't get lashes for any other action. So, Amar Rabbi Apoteliki, he says, in order to resolve this problem, Mishum dehave klal uprat hamaru hakim zemizeh. This is not a classic klal uprat. What's a klal uprat? A klal uprat is when you have a general and a specific within the same pasuk or within two pasukim, very close to each other. These are far apart. The klal is in Perek Bet. The klal is in Perek Vav. They're nowhere near each other. You don't do a klal and prat that way. You could still say what we said before. There's a general rule, then there's an exception where it kind of stands out. Well, then it comes to teach about all other cases. Okay, that's the Hayah bichlal, yatsa min haklal, lo lamed latzmo yatsa, not to teach about himself, but to teach about everything else. Now, kol klal uprat, so klal uprat klal meru hakim is, and he says kol klal, and he says a general rule. Rabbi Apoteliki, kol klal uklal meru hakim is, ein danim oto b'klal uprat. When you have a klal and prat far from each other, it doesn't come into the general rules of klal and prat. Well, on that, we're going to have a difficulty. We're going to get off on a completely different topic till the end of the stuff, which is Mativ Rav Adar bar Ava v'Amri Lakdi. Some people say it was not Rav Adar bar Ava, it was Kadi, meaning it was said by some unknown Emora. But they come and bring a difficulty on Rabbi Apotoriki, who said, and now they're going to say, klal uprat amir chokim zemizeh, ain't anima toba klal uprat. What do you mean you don't do a klal uprat? We're going to show you that you do a klal uprat, even though they're completely separated from each other. Okay, what's the topic? Where you slaughter the korban chatat, the sin offering. When we know we slaughter it in the north, where do we get it from? That's what we're going to see in the Braita. V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a Braita? V'shachatoto b'mkom asher yishchat et ha'olah lifnei Hashem. Chatat, who? This is the chatat of the Nasi. It's in chapter 4 of Vayikra, verse 24. And it says, if a Nasi sins, then, right, we learned a lot about this in Horayot, and other places also in Zvachim, then what do? You bring it and you slaughter it in the place where you slaughter the Ola. Okay, it's a chata. Now, hechan Ola nishchetet, where is that? B'tzafon. Avzeh b'tzafon. V'chi anu mikan lemedim. They say, wait a minute. How can you learn that the seir of the nasi, that the nasi brings if he may accidentally sins, has to be slaughtered in the north from that pasuk? What do you mean? Halok kfar ne'amal. It says in a different pasuk, okay, jumping ahead, Vayikra chapter Vav, verse 18, Bimkom asher tishachet ha'olah tishachet ha'chatat. Now this is a pasuk that starts off with Zot Torat ha'chatat. These are the rules of the sin offering. And sin offerings in general, the place where you slaughter the Olah, that's where you slaughter these two, which is in the north. So that means all sin offerings, which would include the seir of the nasi, the goat offering of the nasi. Why does it specify? So what did this come and stand alone for? It's to say that it's completely disqualified if you didn't do it in the north. This is what we learned. It repeated it to say it's essential. Now, the Braita continues. Is that what you say? This is why it stood on its own. Maybe it's coming to say no. Now, why do they think this? Because maybe it's a klal uprat. Now, what's a klal uprat? Only what the prat is. So even though it says zotorat hachatat, which is general, and you're supposed to slaughter it in the north, maybe when it says it specifically in this case of the nasi, maybe it means only in the case of nasi do you slaughter it in the north, and not all other cases of chatat, which would be a klal uprat. Now, are these psukim near each other? Not at all. And then you would say there's a klal uprat. Now, how do we know that's not the case? Now, not because you can't do a klal uprat, then that would be exactly what Rabbi Patoriki says. But instead, why do they reject this thought? Because this suggestion, Talmud Lamal v'shachat chatat bimkom ha'olah, or bimkom asher yishchat ha'olah. It depends what pasuk you're quoting, but I'm going to go with my version here, which says, we're now quoting a pasuk by the chatat, the sin offering of an individual who sins. It also in Vayikra Kaf Daled, pasuk Kaftet, Vayikra Daled, pasuk Kaftet. There it says a third pasuk. In other words, we have the general pasuk about Zotorat Chatat. We have a specific one about the nasi that theoretically could have told us maybe only there because of the klal uprat. Although notice the Braita never uses the words klal uprat. This is going to come into play later. But right now we think it was because of a klal and prat. But because there's a third pasuk, it's not right. We would have thought maybe it means only in the seir of the nasi. Comes the third pasuk in the seir of the in the chatat of the individual to say, no, actually all chatats. Okay, that third pasuk pushes us to say, no, it's not just in that one case, it's everywhere. Okay, meaning everywhere in the sin offerings. Now, point being, Tama de Katav Rahmana, read one more line in the Braita, then we finish it. Okay, this set up the paradigm, this third pasuk, the one about the individual sin offering, that all sin offerings need to be done in the north. They're slaughtering. Now, the main point that we're looking for is because it had that third pasuk. Halav hachi, were it not for that, what would we have thought? Havamina, we would have said, right? That's what the Braita basically says. You would have thought maybe only this year of the nasi needs safon. My time. Now, what was the reason? Was it not because exactly what I said before? La bishum dehave klal uprat. Even though the seir of the nasi is in chapter 4, and the seir, the chatat, the general sin offering, zotorat chatat, is in chapter 6. They're nowhere near each other. But the Braita must have been thinking the reason to have thought maybe you only do it in the seir of the nasi is because it says, right, because the klal uprat, and then you only have what the prat, right, the case of the prat. Matkefla Rav Ashi says, you're totally wrong about that assumption. Because hai klalu pratu, that's not a klalu prat. You missed some important thing. What is klalu prat? It starts with the klal and moves to the prat, like our case. Lo te'aseh was in chapter 2. Lo te'afeh was in chapter 6. And then we tried to set up a klalu prat. In the end, we said it's not a klalu prat because they're far from each other. Now, in this case, if you wanted to say they were setting up a klalu prat, it's not a klalu prat. It's a prat uklal. The prat is first in chapter 4. The klal is in chapter 6. So, they say the following. Rav Ashi says that's not a klal uprat, it's a prat uklalhu. Now, what are the rules for a prat uklal? Naseh klal mosif ala prat v'yidrabilu l'kol mili. If you're going to start talking in words of klal and prat here, you're going to get to the fact that the opposite conclusion that the Braita did. The seir is the first one, that's the prat. Then we get to the generals, zotarad chatat, generalization, right? All chatat. Now the rules of prat and klal mean, if you end with the klal, it means we're coming to say this is true for everything. So actually, the Braita would need the third pasuk. So obviously you missed the point. It's not putting in klal prat language, which resolves the problem against Rabbi Patriki, because this isn't a klal uprat klal that are separate from each other and they're doing it anyway. It's not. It's something else. So how can you explain the Braita? Now we're going to finish. We're done with Rabbi Patriki and the whole reason why we brought this, but now we just have to explain the Braita. Elatana oto kakashela. The author of the Braita was struggling with the word oto. It says by the Siyar Nasi v'shachat oto b'mkom asher yishchat ta'olah, which means specifically this and not any other one. The word oto is repader, not any klal uprat reasoning. The hachichamer, and what it meant to say is like this: Oino ela shezet unsafon ve'en acher unsafon dekatar rachman oto. Maybe you would have thought without that third pasuk that maybe the word oto is coming to exclude all other sacrifices in the chatat realm. No other chatats need to be slaughtered in the north. And then the Braita says, but you have the third pasuk. Because of the third pasuk, we reject what you would have thought oto is coming for. So now we have one last thing to figure out. So now that we say, okay, but in the end you don't darshan oto to say just this, because you have the third pasuk in the sin offering of the individual, which basically says, okay, because of the sin offering of the individual, that also is done in the north. That teaches you then that zotar ad chatat is this general for all chataot. So then what is oto l'mutemai? So what is this oto coming for? And for this, we're going to get into a sugya that's going to continue on to the next daf, which you can see there's already a siman, nachshon b'shachat of b'pesach, siman. These are 4 answers we're going to give for what the oto is. They're coming there for. So we'll start the first one. Lemiute, oto b'tzafon, v'ein seir nachshon b'tzafon. This is coming to tell you, the seir of the nasi, who sinned accidentally, is in the north, as are all other korbanot chatat. But there's one seir, which is also the seir of a nasi, but a different one. The nasi'im all brought on the Chanukah Mishkan, Parshat Naso, when they consecrated the Mishkan for the first time, each nasi brought a set of korbanot, and one of them was a seir for chatat, like the nasi brings, but different. Okay, that's called seir nachshon because he was the first of the nasi'im that brought. He was the nasi of Shevet Yehuda, and it doesn't need to be slaughtered in the tzafon. That one time in history, those chataot, those seirs for chatat, those didn't need tzafon. Now, sal kadat hachamina. Now, why would you have thought they needed tzafon? Well, hu'il v'yituabi l'inyan smicha litrabi nami l'inyan tzafon. Since we already darshaned, which in a minute we'll see where we darshaned this, we learned from other korbanot chatat that, in fact, also from the seir of the nasi, that the seir nachshon needs smicha. The nasi had to put his hands on the korban physically. Then you would have thought maybe it also needs to be done in the north, like the sin offering of the nasi. But kamash malan, the oto came to teach you this one is done in the north, but not the seirim that you're going to meet in Parshat Naso that are going to happen in the consecration of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. Now, we're going to end with this question, smicha gufe minalan. So where do we get this drasha that smicha also had to be done by the seir of Nachshon? Titania, or right, besides in the other chatats also there. Titania v'samach yado al rosh ha'seir. Back to the seir of the nasi in Vayikra Dalid. It says he has to put his hands on the seir, on the rosh ha'seir. Now, could have just said al rosho, on his head. We were already talking about a seir. Why do you need to repeat the word seir? L'rabot seir nachshon l'smicha divrei Rabbi Yehuda, and that's what we're looking for here. Rabbi Yehuda says that's to teach you that it needs smicha. Rabbi Shimon has a different drasha, but we were looking for this specifically. Rabbi Shimon Omer, we'll finish with Rabbi Shimon, the Rabot Seirei Avodah Zarah l'smicha. It was teaching about a different seir, which is if the community sins and they all worship Avodah Zarah by accident based on erroneous ruling of the court, you also have to do smicha on that korban. And that's what the words haseir is coming to include, an additional seir. Okay, but the point being that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it was including smicha for Nachshon, and that's why you needed oto to teach you. But when it comes to slaughtering in the north, that's not going to be true for the seir of Nachshon. Okay, so let's review our daf now. We started with another difficulty on Rabbah, who said that if they shrink, then we go by what they are now. That other source seemed to say not, because you give the grogrot, but then Rav Dimi said, no, grogrot are different because you can just plump them back up by cooking them, and they'll be the same size as they were before, so we view them as if they're that size. Then we brought this other braita that talked about te'anim al grogrot, grogrot on te'anim. It took us a while to figure out what exactly the case was. In the end, we had to say the ratio was where there's no kohen, and the safe is where there is a kohen, and then we explained why it works or doesn't work in the different scenarios. Then we said, and Rav Papa pointed out that they'd rather do that than say one part of the braita was the Tanakama and one was Rabbi Yehuda. Okay? Better to say two different scenarios than two different Tanaitic opinions. Then we got to this idea about making sure that your dough doesn't become chametz, both before the kmitza and the remainder. Okay? You can't let it leaven. Then we said it's going to be a lo taseh not only for it, but also for every single action you do. You're going to have a separate set of lashes for if it leavens. Then we started with what's the source. So the Mishnah brought the source for before the kmitza. The Gemara brought a braita where we brought Rish Lakish, which explained from the word chalkam we get the shirayim. We said, but lo tafeh chametz chalkam we actually need for the other halacha about needing for each individual action. And we said, no, actually we learned from lo tafeh chametz, that one, and chalkam teaches us about the shirayim. Then we got into this drasha, though, that was in this source about the afiyah, and why do we say that the afiyah builds a paradigm for the others? Why don't we say it's a klal uprat, and then it's only afiyah and not anything else? And then we said, well, that's because they're far from each other, and because they're far from each other, that's what Abu Rabbi Tariki said, there is no klal uprat to klal, because there's no klal uprat, because one is in chapter 2 and one is in chapter 6. On that, Rav Adar said, what do you mean? What about the chatat? There we see you do make a klal uprat, even though they're far apart from each other. And only because we have the third pasuk did we say we don't do the klal uprat. But the Braita never really used the words klal uprat. And to answer the question, they say it wasn't really from the klal uprat, it was from the word oto. And then anyway, we have the third pasuk which overrides oto, to which we then said, well, what is oto for then? And for that we started, our first answer is oto is to say not this year of Nachshon, doesn't mean the north. And we're going to see the other three answers as we go on with our sugya. So with that, I will wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom and have a good day.